Thank you. All right. Yeah, so again, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk to everybody about the Northwest Risk Management Network. So my name is Emily Fusco, and I am the Northwest Risk Coordinator. I work out of the University of Washington as part of the Climate Impacts Group, but this is also kind of a larger collaborative project and network that is really supported by the USGS Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, and then also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide. So just a little history about the risk networks. So the first one started in 2016 in the Northeast, and we've kind of expanded out since then. And so there are several regional invasive species and climate change networks across the country at this point. And so I wanted to, bring that to all of your attention in case you have, you're connected to other regions, that there are also these networks in the Northeast, the Southeast, the North Central there in pink, and then also in the Pacific Islands. And so there are kind of regional specific resources depending on where you are. And we are working still on standing up more of these risk networks in other regions. So hopefully more full coverage in our future. So the coordinator position that I'm in is pretty new. I only started a couple of months ago, even though the Northwest Risk has been around for a few more years than that. And so I'm going to talk about a lot of the resources that we have, and also hope that you all keep in mind we're kind of in a growing period. And so we might be a little slow in getting some new things out, but we have a lot of plans to really expand the resources that we have here in the next coming years. We also are very heavily influenced by an advisory team, and those are folks that are from the region that meet, every couple of months. And I'll talk a little bit more about the advisory team if that's something that any of you are interested in joining, and tell you how to see if you want to be a part of that once I let you know a little bit more about what our network is about. All right, next slide. So I want to start just with this idea about why are we thinking about invasive species and climate change. And so, a lot of folks on this call are, I'm sure, very familiar with managing invasive species, but we are also now in this period of climate change. And so there are a lot of ways that invasive species and climate change might interact that might, maybe change the way that we want to focus our management efforts. And so some of these examples, this is from a North Central management challenge, a North Central brief that was put together. So one of the ways that they might change is that our invasives might shift their ranges into new ecosystems, into new places. So they might move up in elevation or to different latitudes to track climate. And so you might see some, things that you might not have seen before. We might also see cases where climate extremes create extra and new disturbance that can cause opportunities for new invasion. So maybe systems that we weren't as worried about before are going to be more vulnerable as we have these, new disturbance events or more frequent disturbance events. There's also the possibility that some of our methods, like pesticides, might not be effective in these new conditions. And so there might be ways that we need to change how we're managing just so that we can get the efficacy that we're used to. Another thing is that invasives might emerge earlier or stay longer due to these extended growing seasons. And so we see this in the plant world. A lot of non-native plants tend to respond more so to these warmer climate cues than native plants. So they're able to, take even more advantage of these warm days. There could be issues with pests that, maybe you don't have your cold winter lows that might have helped with some of that killing off of different species. And so these are just other ways that can be, these two things interact. There might be new pathways of introduction as different routes open up, or just different competitive behavior with different, with invasive species in a changing climate. All right, next slide. And so we had a survey out in 2020, around about then, where we asked invasive species managers, what are the biggest factors limiting success in your management? And when you look at just invasive species, what we see is that funding and personnel is a huge problem. It's across the board, one of the things that limits people in the most areas. But next slide. If you add climate change into the mix and you ask folks what is limiting you from managing invasive species in a changing climate, this idea of access to information and availability of information becomes a lot more competitive. It's also a big barrier for a lot of folks. So, you know, managing just invasive species, y'all know already like what to do. You've been doing it for a long time in a lot of places, and you have a lot of methods for handling invasives. But then thinking about incorporating climate change, everything is still so new that there's like a lot of questions around information about how to do that effectively. So next slide. And so that's kind of where the Northwest RISC Network will come in. So we think of ourselves as a bridging organization. And one of the things that we're trying to do is provide that information that people need to incorporate climate change into their practice and management. And so, so this is really a way to help bridge the newest research and the cutting edge stuff with what's going on the ground. Next slide. And bridges work both ways. We also want to provide opportunities for our practitioners to be in touch with the research community and let researchers know kind of what is needed on the ground. Where are the big questions? What kinds of new questions need to be answered, and what kinds of information just, in a lot of cases just needs to be synthesized or, kind of applied more to the practice realm. Okay, next slide. And so there are a lot of ways and a lot of resources that we have for connecting our research and practice. One of those things is what we call management challenges. So these are 2-page fact sheets that the RISCs produce. This is one that the Northwest created in the last year. So with the new, with the recent sighting of emerald ash borer out in Oregon, the RISC responded by creating a management challenge to help explain kind of what's going on there, but also putting in like this climate angle. So what's going on with emerald ash borer and climate change, and how do we think about climate change in the context of a new invasive like emerald ash borer? And so these are usually 2-page fact sheets that synthesize a topic as it relates to climate change and invasive species. All right, next slide. We also provide things like research summaries. So these typically focus maybe on a single academic article, and it will be a summary that provides takeaway points and management implications, and they should be really quick, easy reads. We also have put together some resources of relevant peer-reviewed resources, kind of across the board. So decision support and management, fisheries, wildlife, plants, forestry and rangelands, and then also kind of these general theory ideas. So these are also just a way to kind of collate all the information that's out there and make it easier to access for everybody. All right, next slide. The RISCs also put together webinars. And so these are just a couple of examples of webinars that were hosted recently over the past couple of years. They oftentimes will focus on scientific advances. We also might have webinars focused on case studies and management. And a format that's worked really well for the RISC networks is kind of this team up style webinar where we might pair a researcher and a practitioner to talk about a single topic. And we try to make those very conversational and allow folks to ask a lot of questions so that, no matter what area you're coming from, that there's, you're able to get those questions answered kind of in one place and with both of those perspectives. And then, as I said, we're kind of ramping up again. So having this dedicated coordinator position that I'm in is a new thing. And we are kind of in the process of rebuilding a lot of these resources and finding new areas and directions to focus. So hopefully you all will be interested in giving some input on directions that you think you might like the RISC to head. Okay, next slide. We also try to put on a symposium. So the last one was held in 2021, and we had around 330 attendees, largely focused in the western part of the country, and with most of our attendees from Washington. We also had folks from a lot of different organizations, a large federal showing. There was some tribal engagement there. We had, I think, 6% of the audience or so identified as being as representing a tribe. But we'd really like to up those numbers if this is something folks are interested in. We plan to hold another symposium this year, probably in the fall, though those are all things to be determined. It will be virtual. These symposia are virtual, they're free of charge, typically take the format of 2 half days. And then we try to kind of have a lot of variability in the way information is presented. So we'll include talks and workshops, and then oftentimes networking events so that folks can just connect and exchange knowledge that way. Okay, next slide.
Emily, about 4 minutes left.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
And so a lot of that sounds a lot like just sending research to the practitioners. So I want to talk a little bit too about how we help our practitioners influence the research that's done as well. So one big thing that we do is we do conduct surveys. So there was an official survey in 2021. And that was done by EcoAdapt. So they were originally the hosts of the RISC network, the Northwest RISC network. Next slide. And this is just kind of the demographics of who at that time was in the network. So this is out of 300 or so folks that responded. Again, a lot of federal, state, and actually local government folks. And then we have also some NGO, industry, and tribal groups and academics that responded to the survey as well. Next slide. But, we used the survey to kind of identify what the high priority areas were for folks that were in the network at that time. And so we saw things like learning more about Native community resilience or environmental degradation and range shifting species and invasion hotspots as being really high priority areas that folks wanted more information. Right, next slide. We also asked about what kinds of delivery methods folks are interested in. And so we got very positive response about things like opportunities for peer-to-peer knowledge exchange, trainings, workshops, and webinars, and then also ways to present and collate case studies and lessons learned. So those are kind of large focus areas for how we like to try to put information together for people. Right, next slide.
2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, we also often send out, so that was an official survey. We send out surveys to the group both before and after events to get feedback about what kinds of things people want included or what worked well and didn't work well. So there's also, if you missed this survey, totally fine. There are other ways to give input and feedback. Next slide. And then the other big way to be involved would be to join the advisory team. This is a volunteer group, 1-year commitment. You can provide input on the RISC directions and then also provide feedback on products and events. Next slide. So if you want to join the RISC network, the best way to do that is to visit our website. So that's nwrisc.org. All of the resources that I talked about today are on that website, including recordings of all of those webinars and the symposia as well. You can join our listserv and the advisory team from that website. So there's an interest form there if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, and you can submit a form about both of those things, and I can add you based on that. Just again, we are a little slow right now in trying to ramp things up since I came on, but I am getting those forms and I will respond to them. And then you can also go to just risc.org, and that's what this image is on the right. So you can access any of the regional RISC websites from there. So those are all links at the bottom. And then you can also just get in touch with me over email. So you can either email nwrisc@gmail.com or email me directly at my email address, efusco@uw.edu. All right, thank you.